Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind howled through the cottonwoods as gunfire echoed across the dry hills of Wind River Valley, and in the barn of the Dunlow Ranch, a woman stood over a dying colt with blood on her hands and a storm brewing behind her eyes. They called her a curse, the ranch hands whispered. Everywhere she goes, something dies. Vivietta Dunlow had heard the muttered words more times than she cared to count. Her mother's death in childbirth. Her father crushed under a spooked draft horse. 2 ranch hands thrown from green colts the week she turned 20. And now this colt, born breech and lost before she could save it. But Vivietta did not flinch from pain. She rolled up her sleeves and buried the animal herself behind the barn, sweat mixing with dust and grief, while the rest of the ranch kept their distance like she carried sickness in her bones. She walked back toward the house with soil still beneath her nails, the late sun bleeding over the hills. Her little sister Vivi, just 6 years old and too quiet for someone that young, sat on the porch steps clutching a Bible like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away. Her brother Vernon, 8 and already too protective, stood behind her with a slingshot tucked in his waistband. I made biscuits, Vivietta said gently, brushing a leaf from Vivi's braid. You two eat. I'll be back before dark. You going to town? Vernon asked, narrowing his eyes. They do not like you there. I am picking up feed and mending supplies, she said. And I can handle it. He frowned but said nothing more, and she left them there as the sky turned copper and the wind picked up again. The town of Lander was 7 miles off. Vivietta rode her mare down the long trail, her rifle tied behind the saddle just in case. She kept her back straight, chin up, boots steady in the stirrups. No one would see her shaken. At the mercantile, men stopped talking when she walked in. Women gave her sidelong glances, like they feared she might speak some trouble into their lives. She gathered her things without a word, paid in coins worn thin from use, and turned to leave when someone stepped in her way. You Dunlow? The man asked. He was tall, lean, with a trail-worn look and a rifle slung across his back. His shirt was patched at the sleeves, dust clinging to the buttons. His voice was calm, but not cold. I am, she replied. You are the one they call the curse. She stared at him, jaw tight. And you are one of the fools who believes it? No, he said plainly. I do not believe that. She blinked. Then what do you want? I need work, he said. You need help. Vivietta studied him. His eyes were steady, pale like river stone. He was older than her, maybe 30, maybe less. There was something about him that did not move fast, like he had learned patience the hard way. What is your name? She asked. Yates Judson. She nodded once. You know horses? Well enough. Come by the ranch tomorrow. Sunrise, she said, brushing past him. If you are late, do not bother. She left the mercantile without another word, but something about him stuck in her chest all the way home, like a thorn she could not quite reach. The next morning, Yates was already waiting at the corral when she stepped outside. He had saddled 2 horses and was checking their hooves without being told. Vivietta did not smile, but she did not send him away either. He worked quiet that day, and the next after that. He helped Vernon with the windmill, showed Vivi how to coax the milk cow into letting down. He did not ask questions. He did not flinch when people in town whispered about her. And when a storm rolled in one night and a fence went down, he rode out with Vivietta to fix it in the cold rain without complaint. You know, she said as they worked in the mud, you could have gone to any ranch in this valley. None of them needed me like you do. She stopped tying wire and looked at him, really looked at him. His jaw was squared, his hands steady. His shirt clung to him in the rain, and he did not even seem to notice. But it was not just what he said, it was how he said it. Like it was simple truth. You do not think I am cursed? She asked. No, why not? Because I have seen a woman curse a ranch, he said. You are not that. She turned away, heart pounding harder than the thunder overhead. By the 3rd week, the ranch was starting to breathe again. The livestock settled. The children laughed a little more. And Vivietta found herself watching Yates when he was not looking, when he leaned over the fence to speak gently to a skittish mare, or when he crouched beside Vivi to help her plant sunflowers out by the shed. One evening, as the sun bled out across the hills, Yates sat beside her on the porch while the children played in the yard. The air smelled of dust and lilac. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked quietly. "Every day," she said. "But I cannot. It is all we have." He nodded, his fingers brushing against hers on the railing. He did not take her hand. He just let them touch. Her breath caught. "You are not what they say," he said. "I see how hard you fight. How much you carry." She turned to him, her voice low. "Why does that not scare you off?" He looked at her then, really looked. "Because I have carried things too." She did not ask what. The silence between them was enough. It said more than words. Her hand turned, and this time, she meant to take his. Inside, the children laughed over some story Vernon was telling. Outside, the night settled in gentle and slow. Vivietta looked at Yates again. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was not a curse. Maybe she was just tired of being alone. And maybe, just maybe, this man was not afraid of the storm she carried. She let her head rest lightly against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like she had to outrun anything. Not tonight. The mornings had turned cooler, with frost clinging to the pump handle and the valley quiet beneath a thin veil of mist. Vivietta stood near the chicken coop, sleeves rolled down against the chill, watching her breath curl in the air as she scattered feed. The hens rustled and pecked, and she listened, not to them, but beyond them to the silence of a ranch that was starting, however slowly, to steady itself. Yates had gone out before dawn to check the far pasture. She knew because she'd heard the door creak open, his boots pause on the steps, then the soft sound of his horse easing away down the trail. He hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. Vivietta wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back inside. Vivi sat at the table, tongue caught between her teeth as she traced letters in the dirt on the table's edge with a stick of charcoal. Vernon was sharpening a knife slowly and carefully, like he'd seen Yates do. "You riding out today?" Vernon asked without looking up. "Not yet," she said. "I want to make sure the roof on the smokehouse holds before the snow comes. I can check it. I know. But I want to be sure myself." His shoulders rose a little, proud, but he didn't argue. Vivietta reached for a basket and started pulling things together for supper. She was cutting salt pork when the door opened again and Yates stepped in, coat dusted with frost. "Fence line in the south pasture's holding," he said. "But we'll need more nails come next week." He didn't sit yet. He always waited to be invited to rest, like the house still wasn't entirely his to move freely within. Vivietta didn't speak right away. She finished slicing the pork, then motioned toward the bench beside the stove. "You should warm up." He nodded and sat down, holding his hands out to the heat but not rubbing them. He never rushed anything. "There's a man in town asking about you," he said after a moment. Vivietta's knife paused mid-cut. "What kind of man?" "Railroad scout. Said he's looking to buy land west of here." Asked if the Dunlow place was for sale. "It isn't. I told him that." The silence stretched. She turned back to the pork, cut again. "Did he say why he thought it might be?" "He said a place with no husband and 3 mouths to feed tends to get tired." Vivietta set the knife down and placed both hands flat on the counter. Yates stood. "I didn't bring it up to upset you." "I'm not upset," she said, though her voice was quiet. "I'm just tired of being counted out before anyone asks what I want." He was still for a moment, then walked over and picked up the basket she'd been filling. "I'll take this to the shed. You check the roof." She let him go without another word, and once he was gone, she stepped out into the yard again, the sky above her pale and wide. She climbed onto the shed's low roof, testing the boards beneath her feet as she moved along the ridgepole. From up there, She could see nearly every corner of the land, golden grass sweeping toward the foothills, the dark slash of cottonwoods along the creek, and the thin line of smoke from the chimney where Yates had gone. She remembered her father's voice, rough with tobacco and pride, saying there wasn't a thing on this land he couldn't fix with hard work and a strong back. And she remembered the day he didn't come back from the barn, the stillness that followed, and her own hands shaking as she tried to keep things from falling apart. They hadn't fallen, not completely. Not yet. That night, after the chores were done and the children asleep, she found Yates sitting outside, one leg drawn up, his hand resting on his knee. The moon was thin and high, and the air smelled faintly of pine smoke. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth off his side. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked. He looked toward the hills. "I used to." "What changed?" "I stopped believing that starting over meant leaving everything behind. Sometimes it just means standing where you are long enough for something new to grow." Vivietta was quiet, then said, "I keep thinking someone's going to take this from me. The land? The children? The little piece we've managed. They won't. You can't know that. I can stand here with you." She turned her face to his, and though there was no fire between them, there was a closeness that gave off its own heat. He didn't reach for her, and she didn't lean in. But she knew then that he was not going anywhere. "Promise me something," she said. "If I can. If something happens to me, you stay with Vivi and Vernon. They'll need someone. I will. But nothing's going to happen to you. I've learned not to make promises like that." He didn't argue. He only nodded once, as if to say he understood. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage from the hills. She closed her eyes, breathed it in, and laid her hand lightly against his knee. He covered it with his own. They sat that way while the frost settled around them, two people who had stopped running, who had started something neither of them dared name too soon, but something strong enough to hold through the coming cold. The first heavy snow came late that year, after a long stretch of brittle cold mornings and still, sharpened evenings. It fell in the early dark, blanketing the pasture in silence, pressing against the windows like a hush laid over the whole valley. By morning, the world had softened. The fences wore white caps, and the horses breathed rose in thick clouds as Yates led them from the lean-to. Vivietta stood at the hearth, wrapping Vivi's feet in wool socks she'd stitched from an old blanket. The girl's toes were raw from chasing Vernon barefoot through the barn the day before, and she blinked up at her sister with a look half apology, half stubborn pride. "You'll keep these on today," Vivietta said, tying the last knot. "Unless you'd like to lose a toe." "Would it grow back?" Vivi asked, serious. "No. And I won't sew you a new one." Vernon leaned against the table, whittling a short stick down to a point. "I heard frostbite turns your skin black." "Stop it," Vivietta said without looking up. "Eat your mush." She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped outside. Yates had just finished brushing the snow from the saddle and was adjusting the cinch on the bay mare. The sky was clear now, the light sharp. Even his voice seemed quieter in the snow. "Tracks by the creek," he said. "A man on foot. Boots too big for anyone local. Direction? East to west." Followed the edge of the cottonwoods and doubled back. She glanced toward the ridgeline but saw nothing moving. "Could be a trapper." "Could be." He didn't need to say more. There hadn't been trappers this close since before the war ended, and no one walked that far in a snowstorm without reason. "I'll ride out to the line cabin," Yates said. "Check if anything's missing." She nodded, then paused. "Take the rifle." He hesitated just a breath. "You sure? You're not much use without it if something's wrong." He took it from the rack without another word and rode out while the children finished breakfast. Vivietta watched until the horse's tail disappeared past the cottonwoods. Then she pulled on her boots and went to the tack shed to gather the worn harness Vernon had outgrown. Her fingers ached in the cold, but she worked quickly, mind tracing the shape of that boot track, the way Yates had said it looped back. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had returned, and the wind had picked up again. She was oiling the hinges on the barn doors when Yates returned. His coat was dusted with flurries, and his jaw was set tighter than she liked. "There's a blanket missing from the cabin," he said. "And someone bedded down in the loft. Didn't take anything else." She leaned the oil can against the post. "Did you see him?" "No. But he watched me. I felt it." She wiped her hands on her apron. "We'll keep the children close tonight. We should move them into the main room. Sleep near the fire." That night, the wind howled hard against the walls, but the fire held. Vivietta sat with her mending while Yates watched the windows. Vivi curled in a quilt at her sister's feet, thumb in her mouth. Vernon had one hand on a hammer he kept tucked under his pillow, just in case. "Do you think he's still out there?" she asked, Yates' voice low. "I know he is." She looked over at him. "You've seen men like this before?" He nodded. "The kind that drift through winter like smoke, looking for soft places to land. You think that's what we are?" "No. I think he'll come close enough to learn better." There was no fear in his voice, just certainty. She set her needle down. "You've been quiet since the cabin." He didn't move. "It reminded me of Missouri. The winter after the war. I stayed in a place like that. No fire. Just a blanket and a hole in the roof." She folded the hem of the shirt she'd been stitching. "You were alone?" He nodded. "How long?" "Too long." She didn't press. Instead, she stood and crossed to the window with him. Outside, the wind kicked snow across the yard in low, twisting gusts. The porch steps were half buried, and the barn door creaked faintly on its hinges. "You're not alone anymore," she said. He didn't answer right away. Then, "You've stopped looking over your shoulder." She met his eyes. "You give me reason not to." They stood that way until the fire burned low. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not in fear. Not in need. Just to feel the weight of it, the warmth, the living strength of it beside her. He laced his fingers with hers. In the stillness, nothing pressed at the windows. No footsteps broke the snow. Only the wind, and the fire, and the quiet certainty growing between them. That night, she slept with her hand in his, and when the morning came, the boot tracks at the edge of the yard had vanished beneath fresh snow like they'd never been there at all. By late December, the valley had settled into a hush that only deep winter could bring. The snow was hard packed along the trails now, with the sun low and sharp most days, and the sky a pale, endless wash of blue. The ranch moved slower. Animals huddled together for warmth, the children spent more hours inside, and the days passed with the rhythm of quiet labor. Yates had begun carving a new latch for the smokehouse door. The old one had warped in the cold, and every time Vivietta tried to force it shut, it stuck at the hinge. He worked in the lean-to behind the barn, knife steady in his hand, the wood shavings curling at his feet. Vivietta leaned against the post, arms folded, watching the way his brow furrowed in concentration. "You could have been a carpenter," she said. He didn't look up. "I was a wheelwright's apprentice once." She stepped closer, brushing a curl of cedar from his shoulder. "Before or after the war?" "Before. I left it behind when I joined the cavalry." He paused. "Didn't think I'd come back to it. Funny how things return," she said. He set the knife down on the bench. "You think that's what this is? Returning?" She looked at him then. "I think it might be the first time something's come toward me instead of away." He didn't reach for her, not yet, but there was something in his stillness that felt like waiting. That afternoon, she saddled the gray gelding and rode out to the winter grazing paddock. The cattle had huddled along the lower slope where the wind didn't cut so sharp. She checked the herd, counted ears and bellies, then rode the fence line along the ridge. Halfway through, she spotted the broken post snapped clean at its base, likely from the weight of snow and time. No hoofprints nearby, no sign of tampering. She dismounted, tied the reins to a low branch, and began to dig out the frozen soil to brace a replacement. She was halfway through the task when a voice startled her. Need a second pair of hands? She turned. Yates stood behind her, gloved hands empty, but his rifle slung behind his shoulder. I thought you were working on the latch. I was. But you'd been gone too long. She didn't object when he took up the spade and dug beside her. They worked in silence, the cold biting at their cheeks, until the new post stood firm. You always ride out without saying where? He asked as he packed the earth down. Not always. Just when you're thinking too hard. She straightened. I didn't want to bring it home if the fence was worse than I thought. The children don't need worry they can't fix. They already know they can count on you. I'm not sure that's the same thing. He looked at her, snow catching in his beard. You think too much weight on your shoulders means you have to carry it alone. I don't expect anyone else to. I'm not anyone, he said. I'm here. She didn't answer. She stepped past him, untied the reins, but didn't mount. You stayed, she said after a long moment. Even after the tracks. The silence. The way this place wears people out. I stayed because of you. She turned to face him. You don't know everything about me. Then tell me. Her breath clouded between them. She looked down at her gloves, the stitching worn thin at the fingertips. My mother died before I ever saw her face. My father taught me how to fight for the land but never how to let anyone else hold part of it. I've buried horses and dreams, and I get up every morning wondering if there's anything left to build with. There is, he said, stepping toward her. You. She didn't speak. Her throat tightened. He didn't reach for her, not until her fingers lifted of their own accord and touched the front of his coat. I don't know how, she whispered. Then we learned together. She let herself be drawn in, slow as the sun rising over a frozen ridge. His arms came around her not to possess, not to rescue, but to steady. Her cheek pressed against his chest, and the beating of his heart was the only sound in the world for a moment. When they rode back, the sky had begun to blush at the edges, and the cattle still huddled quiet on the slope. The ranch came into view like something earned. Inside, Vernon's boots were drying by the stove, and Vivie had fallen asleep curled beside the hound. Yates took off his coat, hung it without a word. Vivietta lit the lamp, touched his sleeve as she passed, and didn't move away. Later, when the fire had burned low and the house was still, she stood by the window and watched the snow drift silver under the moonlight. Yates came beside her, his hand finding hers in the dark. This time, she held on first. The last week of the year brought a string of clear days and brittle nights. Each morning, frost etched the windows in lacework patterns, and each night the fire had to be fed steady to keep the cold from pressing too close. The meat stores held, the cow was milking enough, and the children took to their lessons without complaint. The ranch had never run so smooth in winter. Vivietta stood at the kitchen table, rolling out dough for the New Year's bread, sleeves pushed high, flour dusting the backs of her hands. She glanced toward the window, where the sky hung pale over the pasture, and let her thoughts drift. There were no missing tools. No tracks near the treeline. No late riders from town. Just quiet, honest work and the knowledge that no one waited to take what was hers. Yates came in with his coat damp from where he'd brushed snow off the barn roof. He shook it out, hung it near the stove, and crossed to where she stood. You need help? He asked, glancing at the dough. You need like a man who splits logs, she replied. You'd ruin it. Fair enough. He leaned against the table, watching her hands move. She didn't glance up, but a smile touched the corner of her mouth. You always watch people work? She asked. Only when I like the way they do it. She laughed softly under her breath and folded the dough with care. I saw Vernon out by the creek, he said. He built a trap for rabbits. Said he wanted to bring something to the table on New Year's. He's been watching you, she said. Learning more than he lets on. Smart boy. Stubborn, too. He's a Dunlow. Yates reached out, brushing a speck of flour from her cheek. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Her hand stilled on the dough, and for a long moment neither of them moved. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "I used to think there wasn't a next," she said. "Just keeping things upright. And now I wonder what it would be like to build something with someone who doesn't leave." He reached for her hands then, warm and firm, still dusted white. "You don't have to wonder." She looked him in the eyes, and this time, she didn't hesitate. "Then don't make me wait." The wedding was quiet, in the parlor, with Vernon standing tall in a shirt too big at the shoulders and Vivie clutching a wildflower bouquet she'd gathered from the creek bed where the snow had melted early. Yates wore his best coat, brushed clean, and Vivietta had sewn her dress from the remnants of her mother's Sunday calico, the hem just touching her boots. The preacher from town came on a borrowed mule, said the words with reverence, and left before the sun dipped too low. No neighbors came. No invitations were sent. But the house was full of warmth, of children's laughter, of the scent of pine and bread and something solid taking root. That night, after the children had gone to bed early from too much excitement and too little sleep, Yates sat with her on the porch steps, the stars sharp above them. "You ever think about leaving now?" he asked. "No," she said, tucking her hand into his. "This is where I want to be." He pulled her gently against his side, and she rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the wind in the trees and the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I didn't know I could feel this settled," she said. "You earned it." They sat there until the cold crept in, then went inside together, where the fire waited, and the home they'd built not with grand gestures, but with quiet days and hard truths stood strong around them. 6 years later, the ranch was still standing. The barn had a new roof. The herd was larger than it had ever been. Vernon had grown into his shoulders and was drawing plans for a second bunkhouse. Vivie had taken to keeping a journal, her letters neat and slanted, her questions endless. And in the garden behind the house, where the sun caught the fence posts just right, a little boy with Yates's eyes and Vivietta's determined mouth toddled after a flock of hens, laughing as they scattered. Vivietta stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, watching the child with quiet pride. Yates came up behind her, sliding an arm around her waist. "He's fast. He gets that from me. I thought he got everything from you." She leaned into him. "He gets your steadiness." The wind carried the smell of spring wet earth, pine needles warming in the sun, the faint sweetness of lilac buds. Vivietta looked out over the land, their land, and felt the weight that had lived in her chest for so long settle into something gentler. "I used to think I'd always be fighting for this," she said. "You don't have to anymore." "No," she said. "Not now." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "We built something, didn't we?" She nodded, her voice soft. "And we're still building." Inside, the bread was rising. The children were laughing. And the sun was climbing higher, slow and golden. There was nothing left unsettled. No fear waiting in the trees. Only love, steady as the earth beneath their feet. And it would carry them into all the days ahead.